Hello, Patriots. It's me, Maximilian Clark. Walter Masterson is still missing, but based on the fact that North Korea retaliated against South Korea by sending balloons filled with garbage across the border, I assume that he's somewhere in Pyongyang. That's Walter's special move if I ever saw one. But lucky for us all, before he disappeared, Walter sat down with writer, journalist, activist Eugene Puryear, who is an expert on the situation in the Congo. Now, last time we talked to Eugene was December, and I had COVID. Now it's June, and I have COVID again, so I think this might be the last time that we have him back for my own health. Anyways, we have a little intro for it, and then the interview, and Walter and I will be back live in the studio next week to talk about all the stuff that's been going on.
All of you jump in my DMs and say, well, why are you talking about Israel, Palestine? You never talk about the Congo. You never talk about Sudan.
We actually did a full episode.
Yeah, I'm like, wait, so we brought in a real journalist that teaches seminars on the Congo.
What is the most informed person on the thing? And it's a great episode. It's from 4 months ago now.
Yeah, it's called King Congo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we brought in, and we're bringing him back because we're bringing him back to update us about what's happening in the Congo and also to explain what's going on in Sudan.
Yeah, perfect. So please enjoy. It's going to be informative. It's going to be fun. You'll laugh. You'll cry. Maybe, I don't know, you're going to do any of those things? I haven't heard the interview.
Yeah, no, they'll definitely do a lot of crying because it's messed up what's going on in Congo and Sudan.
You'll breathe out of your nose, but sometimes you also breathe into your nose,
Yeah, but it's a guy. It's
a good. You'll see.
It's a comprehensive, unsexy interview.
Yeah, stop spoiling it. Let's go.
Yeah. So all right. Thanks for joining me again, Eugene. So last time you jumped on, and you gave me an entire episode where you explained it in such comprehensive detail that I was left way more confused about what's happening in the Congo. If I want to say it's complicated about the Congo, what else can I say? The people that have co-opted that term, they've ruined it. We can't have nice things. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's complicated, so pay no attention. I think the other thing, the way for people to understand it easily is basically just like, do you like using a cell phone? Do you like using a laptop? Do you like plugging things in so they have power? And if the answer to that is yes, then what's happening in the Congo is super relevant to you because it's basically a battle over who's going to make the most money off of you buying laptops and plugging them in and charging them.
Oh my God. It's like a competition. It's like who wants to be a billionaire?
and in a wild way, even the day we're recording this, a big thing came out. A guy, Dan Gertler, an interesting name. He's an Israeli businessman. He was one of the biggest business people in Congo, but he was so corrupt, basically it all fell down on him. Even the U.S. had to sanction him. But then today, the U.S. just announced they're going to lift the sanctions on him and allow him to, sell his businesses, making maybe even close to $1 billion. And they said, and this is what's wild about it, that they're doing this to prevent corruption, and that if he's allowed to profit off of his corrupt deals, it'll make U.S. companies more comfortable investing in a non-corrupt environment. I don't even understand that, but basically bottom line, what it means is if you're a U.S. investor, they're saying, if you do some corruption and you get caught, here's a sign that let a few years pass and we'll just let it slide because we hate China. So if you're going to help us against China, cool, you can be corrupt. You might be in a little trouble for 3 or 4 years. But then we'll let you off the hook.
Okay, I think, let's read the subtext. I think what they're trying to say is, as long as you don't sell your business interests to China, it's fine. We're going to lift your sanctions and just sell it to someone not China.
That's exactly correct. And they're actually even saying it. And there's a guy named Amos Hochstein who works for the Biden administration he's been pushing this deal. And he was like, it's national security implications if we don't let Dan Gertler make $1 billion. And all the Congolese groups that work around, the conditions in the mining fields are like, well, you have him under sanctions. So why not just make him give up the companies and get no money? You have the power to do that. But clearly, it's all, they want to make sure that.
Then multinational companies wouldn't invest in the Congo. Where would the Congo be without multinational corporations. I think that's the problem, is we need more multinationals to come into the Congo.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree?
Their record has been, by many accounts, spotless from a White House perspective, right? Like, making billions of dollars, making corrupt deals, using it to pay off politicians in France and the US and elsewhere. And Apple is doing well off of this whole regime. So in some ways, they might say, yeah, we need more multinationals because it's basically.
By the way, when you think corruption, what is it? What does that mean when he says this? He's done corruption.
So, if he came on and said this, and maybe he'll get in your comments or your DMs and combat this because he said it's not true. But basically, you come in and you say to whoever is in charge, like the mining ministries, from top level in Congo to like the bottom level, like military guys who are on the ground in these areas, and you basically just say, I want this deal. I want to be involved here. What's it going to cost? And then they tell you, this is what it's going to cost. You pay them off. You get the deal. And then you're able to, extract the minerals however you may like. And that is basically, the state of affairs in Congo. Just the president was just in France, and that's what it came down to. They have a great, nice phrase about it now. It's called investing in small and medium enterprises. But what it essentially means is you have to give more money to a clique of people around the politicians who are ruling the country in order to get these deals. So it's like, corruption plus as opposed to what it was before. So if you had to pay off one guy before, now you might have to pay off 3 or 4 guys. But, they're small and medium enterprises, and that sounds great, right? Everyone loves small business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if this guy was just, paying people off to do business and then not using children as laborers, maybe adult age, something like that, maybe, paying them a decent wage, not slave labor, he could make a case where I'd be like, all right, you know what? I'm going to overlook this, that you paid off the mining ministry, and maybe, but so what is going on in terms of the body count that has, accelerated in the past few months? What is behind that? What is that?
Same thing, minerals. I mean, there was a really, honestly, tragic situation on May 3rd of this year where a refugee camp ended up being bombed by this insurgent group, rebel group, whatever you want to call them, M23, which is basically backed, but not basically, it is backed by Rwanda. And they've been launching a offensive over the past several months to seize a lot of territory in Eastern Congo, including this area called Rubaya, which is very, very rich in terms of coltan and other minerals. So essentially you have this sort of rebel group trying to control this territory in alliance with Rwanda so that they can have a stranglehold on coltan, which is one of the big things in batteries for, anything now that's running. So they can have a stranglehold on the production and the export of that. And so in the context of this, they have been waging this struggle, and for whatever reason, it's not even 100% clear to me, they decided to bomb this refugee camp in Goma, which is the main city in Eastern Congo. But either way, the fighting has heavily accelerated now across a number of different fronts because they're trying to take advantage of the fact that there's a lot of disarray, like the UN is pulling out, the Congolese military isn't, fully together. You have some other forces that are working with them, but they're not fully together. So there's an opportunity for them to try to seize more territory. But what it boils down to when people look at conflict in the Congo and the Eastern Congo is if you control the ground, if you control the territory, you control the money. It's $24 trillion in wealth in the Congolese soil. And there's a lot of different things to it, but that's basically what it boils down to is different groups for different reasons wanting to make sure that they have the key position to be able to be the intermediary between the big international corporations that are in Congo and the people on the ground who are pulling the minerals out of the soil.
So the people doing the genocide it's not just one group. It is just, I feel like in the United States, we have this thinking of when we think of civil war, we think North versus South. This isn't North versus South. This is Northeast versus Northwest versus Southeast and Southwest. It's just anywhere on your compass, any point on your compass, that's a faction. So that's why it doesn't get talked about the same way, because you have there's not like the supreme oppressor. Is it the actual government that's doing the killing, or is it just militias?
It's both, actually. And and that's why, because you got dozens of groups. You have basically two main camps. And like one camp is semi-arrayed around the Congolese government. And that camp is probably the most popular with Congolese people in a way, because the other camp is really groups that are primarily allied and moving around with Rwanda. And so most Congolese people feel that Rwanda is trying to take advantage of the country of Congo. They feel that they're trying to take control of all the minerals and get the wealth out of Congo. So a lot of people in Congo feel like, yes, we want to have sovereignty. We want the Congolese sort of government, quote unquote, to at least control the borders. But then also there's a lot of Congolese who critique the government because, for instance, they killed 100 people in a massacre a couple months ago who were protesting around not having enough, one, them not winning the war, but also around the conditions, not putting enough money from the wealth into social programs and things like that. So you have the government on the one hand getting a lot of support to fight against these sort of Rwandan allied groups, but then also cracking down on their own people when they criticize the government for not actually doing enough for them. And all these militias, of which there are dozens and dozens and dozens, then sort of split on each side. Some ally more with Rwanda, and that's because of sort of ethnic issues that are somewhat complex, but related to, the Rwandan genocide, as it's often called. And then others are just groups that have kind of popped up over the years because there's so much insecurity that they've been able to form and fill a power vacuum, but they tend to work a little bit more closely with the government in that regard, but they also play their own game. So there's kind of those two main camps, but a lot of smaller players who are all trying to inch their way in somehow, some way.
Yeah, it doesn't give us the soundbite and the headlines we need to like popularize, the plight of what's going on there the same way. I mean, the only simple way to look at it is we had a decent leader that was assassinated decades ago. They were doing okay. And, this guy had the crazy notion of nationalizing the country's resources. And I mean, moron, really. You don't say that. Maybe you think that. You don't vocalize that.
Yeah, Patrice Lumumba, as he did. I mean, he was, and in a way, it's like they made an example of him. It's sort of like, if you're going to openly come out and fight for your own rights, we will actually kill you. And, they still haven't done anything. Belgium, which committed essentially a massive genocide with millions of people over the years of colonization. But they recently actually just sent back, just to give you a sense of how ridiculous it is.
Oh, the tooth?
The piece of a tooth. Wasn't even a whole tooth. And they were like, oh, listen, look how great we are in Belgium. Like, we really care about the legacy.
We sent it back.
Here's the tooth, but they won't pay any reparations. But that is basically what it is, because after you got rid of Lumumba, you have Mobutu, who just, was kleptocratic. The country had no real government other than, the cronies who were around him. He dies in 1997. And then basically from that point on, you've had total and complete instability. And in that context, a lot of different political forces have arisen, which is why if you look at Congo's politics today, the most popular sort of agenda is around unity for the Congo, because most people feel like, yes, the country is falling apart. There's essentially, business groups, warlords, or whoever that people want to come in. But it really does start in 1960 and like a managed process, almost like managed chaos. Because again, if you're Apple, if you're, CATL, the battery company in China, if you're, whoever now, Ford, whatever, it's all basically working out for you because you're still getting what you need to make your products and make your money. But for the people in Congo, it's like total chaos. So I call it managed chaos because it's not random. And big players are influencing it. And it's just that they don't care. Who knows? Who knows what's in their heart? But at the end of the day, they're not willing to put their profits, above actually what's happening with people.
Yeah, I mean, because they just want to get some cheap stuff and keep the supply lines moving. And the militias are happy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. Oh, wait, is this also where King Leopold did the genocide?
It is. It is where King Leopold did the genocide.
I went to educate myself on this, and Google was like, which one, bro? And I was like, oh my God. This is where King Leopold killed 10 million people.
Yeah.
Right.
Named a lot of people too. If you spoke out too much against the government, they cut off your lips. If you spoke out against the petitions on the rubber plantation, they cut off your arm or your hand. So they killed millions of people, but they also maimed hundreds of thousands of people just to send a message to this is what we do. This tiny little country of Belgium, almost all its wealth came directly from the Congo. And one of the reasons they hated Lumumba the most, is the king at that time when they had independence came to Congo and he read like a little statement or whatever. And I guess they thought that Lumumba was going to read like a nice little "We love Belgium," but he went in on Belgium. And apparently the king was so upset that then he started to say, we have to set in motion this whole thing against them. They would have done it anyway, but it just shows how ridiculous it is that Belgium, because there was like a negative speech, the king was like, yeah, we got to actually overthrow this guy and do whatever you got to do to cover it. And he played a whole role in it as well, and like sort of bringing together different forces within the government who are against Lumumba and helping them act sometimes even behind the scenes of the government itself to make sure they got rid of him.
So, all right, just to recap, Rwanda.
Backed by the U.S. and Europe.
Okay, so Rwanda, backed by the United States and Europe, is trying to gain a foothold in the Congo.
Mm-hmm.
That's horrible. I didn't think the United... I was joking with people when they would come at me, because people come at me and they go, why are you only talking about Israel and Gaza? Why you have never talked about what's going on in the Congo? And my response would be, oh, yeah, let me write my congressperson and say, stop sending weapons to the Congo. And then I thought, well, no, that's not happening because that'd be crazy. But no, that is happening. Are we sending weapons to Rwanda?
We are. And in fact, like Rwanda has become kind of almost like a security contractor for the West in Africa. So for instance, they're getting paid by the EU a lot of money right now to go to Mozambique to allegedly fight ISIS in Mozambique. But the most important factor is this area where the fighting is happening. Total Energy, the big French gas company, has this huge, multi-billion dollar gas thing going on, and they weren't able to build it because of this so-called ISIS. So Rwanda is there, and you see them in other parts of Africa. They're getting paid by the United Kingdom right now to take refugees from the UK. They're just going to deport them to Rwanda. It's not exactly clear what's going to happen to them when they get there, but nonetheless, they're getting paid a lot of money by the UK to do that. And they're they've always worked very closely with the US on various different agendas. So you see them popping up more and more in Benin and other places, Western allied countries, as like because they have a good army in Rwanda. So it's like, this is the country that can come in and help you. But the U.S. is training them. Almost all the Rwandan military is trained by the United States. They're giving funding to them. But then they're trying to cover it by then making these statements against Rwanda to appease the DRC government, but they're not changing anything. But they're making it seem like they're against them while continuing the same basic reality. And on top of that, they're funding like $400 million. It's a very expensive railroad that'll go from southern DRC through basically the border of DRC and Zambia to Angola to make it easier for European and American companies to get goods out of there. But this area, the border of DRC and Zambia, is probably the place where we actually know the least about what's going on in terms of working conditions, but they're considered to be the worst, including like potentially a lot of modern day slavery happening like deep back in these, areas that are hard to reach, these jungles. So the US is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get, slave mined minerals to get easier to the Atlantic Ocean so they can make more money. So they're working on both ends. But yeah, Rwanda, US, France, very, very tight. But you got to watch out for the okie doke because the US especially is now really aggressively putting out statements against Rwanda because they don't want DRC to work more with China. Basically, that's what it really comes down to because China is building a lot of roads, hospitals, whatever in their competition. And so the president was there last year, big meeting between President of China, President DRC. So they want to make them happy by making it seem like they're against Rwanda. But when you look at the money's flowing, they're still there.
Okay. So China is just trying to compete and they'll do whatever they need to with regards to competition because they want to paint themselves as the easier, softer nation to deal with, blah, blah, blah. Are they any better?
I mean, in that regard, yes, because they're actually providing more what you might call fringe benefits. But it's one of those kind of like relative questions, because at the end of the day, since what they care about is getting the minerals out for, the maximum profit, they aren't really doing that much to curtail the actual working conditions. So in some ways, they're contributing to the development of the Congo in a big way. But on the same token, they're contributing to the terrible working conditions as well. I've done some reporting on this. There is some information out there that there are differences now between the Chinese government and some of these Chinese companies. The embassy in DRC has been very aggressive in trying to speak out against some of this, but the companies aren't really changing. So it's like a relative difference, but they could certainly do significantly more.
They're building hospitals, they're building schools, but they're not changing like the material conditions and the working conditions.
Exactly. It seems like the government has really kind of put the squeeze on them to start delivering more social benefits. But at the end of the day, you still have this issue with the miners. Now, what I will say is when you look at Africa in general, that China basically follows whatever rules they need to follow to get ahead of the West in these various competitions. So if DRC was to raise the stakes and say you have to do X, Y, and Z if you want to be there, highly likely that China would actually agree to that. And in different countries, that's why you have very different outcomes in terms of how China's trade is working. Like 81% of people in Nigeria have a very positive view of China based on the polls. And that's not necessarily because Nigeria is a great country, but in the context of how they've negotiated the trade, the benefits are so clear that people are for it. So it really is also a question of what are the African governments doing to actually put pressure on China, because the Western governments will never do anything whatsoever. And they basically just say, too bad, too sad. And that's partially how they've been pushed out. And now they're trying to change that. But yeah, for the average miner, no one is really advocating for them on the international stage except themselves. But there's more and more organizing going on amongst these miners, and they're starting to come together in interesting ways. And that will put pressure on all.
What ways?
What they're mainly trying to do is form these cooperatives. So it's like if people have seen the photos or the videos of people like digging in the dirt, the pit mines. That's called quote unquote artisanal mining. So basically what a lot of these
are you kidding me? That's called artisanal mining.
It's called artisanal mining. That is exactly what it's called.
And that's not unironically.
Completely unironically. That is like actually everyone refers to it like that. It's in all the documents. It's completely ridiculous, but that is what it's called. Makes it sound nice, right?
And they made the labor movements, the co-ops, they made that up. They called it artisanal mining.
No, they don't call it that. It's just I don't even know who made it up, but I guess, they just want to get in the conversation. So they call themselves artisanal miners to pass that because they need to get to like what we actually need. So they're basically just kind of come together in like big co-ops with like tens of thousands of miners so that they can then use that as leverage, right? So they can raise the price of what they get for it so that they can use the proceeds to bring in, more technologies and safety equipment and whatever it may be. And this is happening all across Africa. It's happened probably the most in Zimbabwe, but it's happening in Burkina Faso. It's happening all over that miners are coming together more to try to like use their collective power. So it's difficult because they're heavily repressed, but that's a big move that's happening now amongst the mining communities, is how they can like bring themselves together and then leverage that unity against everyone in the sphere and potentially change the nature of mining.
Getting together and collectivizing their labor. Yay. Okay. Well, that's somewhat refreshing that it's not, just all child labor and, murder.
Yeah. People should check out Friends of the Congo here in the US. That's one of their big projects, is they support miners working together, and they also help them produce like movies and stuff like that about their conditions and other pieces. So yeah, Friends of the Congo in the US is like a great resource for people to learn more and if they want to support.
Yeah. And so, wow. And so you said you were going to dip over there in the fall, or when were you going to go there?
I'm hoping to go second half of 2024, and we're hoping to get to the east. That's a little bit easier. To get into the southeast mining area is a lot tougher because, people don't want you to see what's happening there. But we're going to see if we can get there and do some reporting on the ground.
So southeast, so that's bordering what countries?
That's bordering Zambia. It's also bordering Angola. I think some of it actually might border Tanzania as well. It's Katanga province, which is like the most mineral rich province. There's not a lot of fighting in Katanga province. The eastern provinces that are north of there, North Kivu, South Kivu, are where most of the fighting's happening. But a lot of the minerals are coming out of Katanga, which is also, by the way, talking about Patrice Lumumba, they broke away when Lumumba became prime minister and were like the Belgian US sort of Trojan horse to help bring down Lumumba in Congo.
Were they like Donbass? Like it's like that type of energy.
They were trying to start their own country in a similar kind of way, and they had whatever justification. Now, of course, after the Lumumba was gone, the Belgians and the others turned on them and made them come back and be under Mobutu. But yeah, they were trying to form their own country, and they thought they could be like, if they were the most pro-Belgian kind of like an Israel kind of situation, right? Like if we do whatever America says, they'll give us money. They thought if we do whatever Belgium says, they'll like keep us there. But then they learn like, nah, that's not how it works in Africa.
No, damn. Yeah, no, they're like, no, we got Mobutu, bro. Like, no, we're good. We're good.
We're set.
We're okay. We're okay. Wait, what's the other country going on that just recently like aligned with Russia? Was it Burkina Faso? Which one?
Yeah, well, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have been doing quite a bit in terms of working with Russia because they kicked out the French and they've now started working more closely with Russia. That's upset the United States, which is why the U.S. is now being kicked out of Niger. But it really is the whole continent. Even Nigeria, which is considered super pro-Western, very close to the U.S., very close to the U.K., they've been doing a lot more to increase their relations with Russia. At the end of the day, I think it comes down to what the Nigerian foreign minister said about why they kicked out the U.S. And he was like, listen, we didn't want to kick them out, but they came here and they said, okay, you can't work with Iran, you can't work with Russia, you got to do whatever we say. And it's basically his answer was like, colonialism is over. So we're going to work with whoever we want. We'd love to work with the US, but if you're going to try to tell us who our friends can be, it's not going to happen. So I think a lot of Africans now feel like, okay, if this is how it's going to be, where you're going to say you got to choose one side or the other, well, you might not be happy with what we do because we're going to choose people who respect us more. And because Russia never says don't work with the US. So from their perspective, it's like, why would we put ourselves in a camp of people who limit our ability to develop our country, to protect our security, because they know they can make good relations with Russia in certain areas, also with Iran, also with China, obviously. So from them, they don't want to choose, but America trying to make them choose is, I think, making more African countries actually choose Russia because they feel like, okay, fine, we're going to choose the people we feel respect us.
So now that we've talked about the Congo, what is going on in Sudan?
Yeah, Sudan. Basically, Sudan is a civil war type scenario. And it's two basic sides in this one, really three basic sides, but two basic sides. You got the government, military forces on one hand, and then you have, they're often referred to as SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces. Other side, you have the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, which was like a government affiliated armed force, but they had their own sort of independent reality. Those two forces were working together until about a year ago, because what happened in 2019 is you had tens of millions of people, just average everyday working class Sudanese who rose up, overthrew the government at the time. And it looked like they were going to sweep away all these people, including the RSF, SAF, and have a whole new day in Sudan. So they started working with America, Saudi Arabia, several other countries to create kind of a fake deal that was supposed to bring democracy to Sudan. But ultimately that period did not succeed. 2021, you have a coup that's mounted by SAF and RSF again together. And then they were trying to divide the spoils amongst themselves, because when you look at the mass movement that was happening, they wanted all the big oligarchs that were tied to the military to take back a lot of their companies that they had been taking back, to get rid of the IMF deal, to raise the minimum wage, to bring in free healthcare and education. And so all of these rich generals did not want that. So they were trying to figure out a way to make it look like it was a democracy so that the West would support them, to divide the spoils amongst themselves, but they could not agree. So then ultimately in 2022, these two sides go to war against each other, and the country now has been embroiled in this massive war because of the fact that you had two sets of elite, military-aligned generals that could not agree on how to divide the spoils amongst themselves and keep down this huge mass movement that wanted to change the whole country.
Wow, you said that all in one breath. Damn. Okay. It's not complicated. The military is fighting amongst itself.
100%. 100%. The military divided, their main disagreement literally was the head of RSF or the head of SAF going to have the ultimate control over the military. So it was that limited in a way. And because they both want power, they couldn't come to an agreement. But it was kind of that simple. I mean, there's layers to it when you get sort of deeper, who's allied with the military, who's allied with RSF. That does get into a lot of different sort of historical pieces, but those two basic camps are there. And then you have a lot of people who were involved in the sort of big protest movement that, many of them are sort of pox on both your houses in the war, peace movement, but some have started to work with the military just because the RSF is viewed as so much worse in terms of what they have been doing, the killings and,
so the SAF is like the lighter genocide. RSF is like these people, like they're awful. Are they Southern? Are they Northern? What are they? What is RSF?
Well, yeah. And so it's sort of like an East-West conflict to some degree, although it has some different pieces. And I would say SAF is presented as often better than RSF, but like they just bombed a bunch of refugee camps. So I think that's kind of dubious. But nonetheless, RSF, is probably a little bit worse, but it's tough to say. But RSF really comes out of the Darfur region, where SAF is more tied to. So if you think about Sudan, right, the Nile River runs through Sudan into Ethiopia. So traditionally, the people who rule Sudan, they call them the riverine elite. They tend to be more associated with areas like Khartoum and others that are close to the Nile River. And then in the west and the east and the south, traditionally those areas don't benefit as much from the wealth. They are not as involved in the political leadership and so on and so forth. So RSF is more out of sort of the Darfur area, and they are ultimately a militia that was formed by the previous government. Now it's not really a militia, it's like a big army, but they were formed as part of the conflicts in Darfur that people maybe heard about, but undoubtedly don't have the correct information, that were basically conflicts over land and sort of citizenship rights in Darfur. So they're coming from the West, but their discourse is very much like, we are a movement that wants to bring the margins more to the center, which is a big feature going back 50 years of Sudanese politics, is this West, East, and South trying to not be marginalized in the political structure. So the East is very much with Sudanese armed forces because, for various different reasons, but there's a lot of groups that support them there, but they also have sort of a similar discourse around leadership. And some of this is about certain leaders who think that this is an opportunity to improve their representation and thus, improve their ability to access the resources that are produced by their own region. The South is the same thing. You also have groups in Darfur who are also supporting Sudanese armed forces because they've fought for many years against RSF. So at that level, it does start to get a little bit more complex, but the basic division is really between two sides of the coin who want to have ultimate power over all of Sudan.
Okay, during the first genocide, because that's where we are, the first genocide going on like in the aughts and everything. Who were the awful people in that genocide?
Well, listen, that's complex because both sides, you could say there are a lot of negative things you could say about them. Because what you had in that part of Darfur, and just to give you an even deeper piece, the Save Darfur campaign was actually created primarily by Israel because they were trying to weaken Sudan because Sudan was a big supporter of the Palestinian resistance. So it gets deep. But what you have is you have multiple tribes in Sudan. Some are herders, some are farmers. So right there, that's a big disagreement because water and land become a big piece. So the people who are more herders were more on the side of the government, the so-called Janjaweed, and the people who were farmers were more on the side of fighting the government. And those were the forces that were considered like the good guys, although, it was a war, so there's a lot of negative things happening. But you also had within that even more complex issues over tribes and ethnic groups that historically, going back to British times, had like a legal title to a certain area. And then you have people who didn't have a legal title, but because of climate change, because of other issues, were then moving into these areas saying like, well, we have to stay alive. So we need access to water and land too. So that also created a division. So you had these divisions over land, over water, that also had an ethnic element to it. And that got very tense. And there was a lot of terrible things that went on. I mean, I'm not here to defend the Janjaweed whatsoever, but it was kind of a one-sided story what people got. Like they saw like, oh, there's this terrible Janjaweed. They're Arabs murdering Africans, which is also not really correct. I mean, there's elements of that speak to the language you speak, but they're all Africans. And, like if anyone from that region got stopped by the cops in America, they would be executed because they would be considered to be Black African people. So like that, and even some of the people who are like Africans also speak Arabic, so there was all these complex issues, but because Israel was so, committed to destroying Sudan, they were able to create this narrative in America around Save Darfur. And it wasn't like it was all fake. It was so simplified that it undermined the fact that there are these really, I think, more important, deeper realities about how people make a living, how they survive, and about colonial borders. because Chad, Libya, and Sudan, and some degree Ethiopia, and some degree Central African Republic, a lot of these groups like live across all these different borders, right? So like then there's also the issue of how that plays into who gets to live where, who gets to be the political leader, who gets to make money, all these different sort of pieces. So it's a complex issue, but nonetheless, that was there. And that is the genesis of the RSF, was these pro-government forces, so-called Janjaweed, that the central government in Sudan empowered to fight these other forces, like, ironically enough, many of whom are now allied with the government, like the JEM was one of the big movements, Sudanese Liberation Army, who were fighting for their own rights to exist in this territory. So it's like, in a way, kind of all sides had elements of their claims that were very legitimate, but because of the way power politics plays out, it ends up in a major war. There were a lot of attempts in the late 80s, early 90s to create a dialogue between a lot of these groups, but it just never really came together, unfortunately. That was a big hope that people had about what happened in 2019, that it would finally create the basis by which you could have a real dialogue in Darfur that was not just the warlords, but that would include, say, the people living in the refugee camps, the poor small farmers and others, that they would finally be more empowered in the political agenda. And so in Darfur in 2019, 2020, the big protests that were happening that were part of this nationwide movement were really coming from that force, especially from the refugee camps, where there's a lot of very, like the Communist Party is strong there, other left-wing parties are strong there. And that was a big hope. And of course, that has now been kind of washed away in the war. Same thing in the East. There was thought that there could be a new process.
You had Arab, you had Muslim communists in refugee camps. Dude, well,
a lot of them are Muslims, a lot of them are atheists, but yes, you do have.
I hear that, and I'm like, all right, they're gonna get bombed today. Oh my! Like I'm so terrified for those people. Like,
well, Sudan actually is a big communist movement. It's kind of unknown, but it's historically, going back to the 50s, one of the biggest communist movements in Africa and around the world. And they play a big part. They played a big part in 2019. They have a lot of influence in the trade unions and others. But there's all sorts of people. The Ba'ath Party, for instance, which of course originally comes from Iraq, is very influential as well in Sudan. So the politics in Sudan are an interesting mix of kind of the Arab nationalist politics.
You get Sunni, you're getting Sunni, Shiite, yeah.
You do have that, because Iran was very close with the government that was overthrown, Bashir, which even though they were the Muslim Brotherhood, which is allegedly against Iran, they actually wanted to have an Iran-style model in Sudan, which is partially why there is a lot of people who were against them, because, Sudan is a country that is actually has it's a lot of Muslims, of course, but a relatively more secular discourse. Sufi brotherhood, Sufism is huge in Sudan. It's one of the few countries where that's one of the biggest currents of Islam. So anyway, you have a lot of these sort of complex issues interplaying over each other, but it really all boils down to in Sudan that you had a really diverse mass movement of tens of millions of people who were like, we're going to just I'm talking about people from again, communist to pro-Western liberals. It was very diverse. Ethnic groups from all over the country saying, let's just change the whole thing. Let's hit reset. Let's come together democratically. Let's restructure the country. Let's build it back up. But the people who were in power were like, nah, that is not going to happen. And the U.S. was supporting them heavily in cracking down because they were fearful of this movement for a lot of reasons. One was Israel, is they were worried that if you had a true democracy in Sudan, that it would actually become even more pro-Palestinian.
Oh, that's funny. So people are like, oh, why are you talking about Israel and Gaza? You must just hate Israel. How come we don't talk about what's going on in Sudan? So yeah, let's talk about Sudan. So Israel was funding one side to put down any, protests because they were afraid that the people that would come to power were going to be anti-Israel.
Yeah, this is what Save Darfur was about. They wanted to break Sudan apart. And that's now why a major reason why the U.S. and Sudan were against the protest movement, and why the U.S., by the way, in 1998 bombed Sudan, the only pharmaceutical factory, because you can look now, if people who follow Sudan, every Sudanese person who is Save Sudan on social media, if you look at their feeds, it's also Save Gaza, 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 Gaza. I was actually talking to a friend in Omdurman, which is one of the most hard hit areas, who sent me a message saying, I love what you guys are doing on Breakthrough News about Gaza. And I'm just thinking wow, this guy is under siege in his neighborhood and is we got to be for Palestine. So yeah, historically, Sudan is one of the most pro-Palestinian countries on earth. And it always has been very close to Palestine. They give money, they give weapons, they give refuge. Like, it's pretty much uncompromising. And so if you have a democratic dispensation in Sudan, there's no Abraham Accords, there's no working with Israel, there's none of that. And a lot of these, they were called resistance committees that were behind the protests. They were openly saying, we must get rid of Abraham Accords, end all normalization with Israel, and we have to kick out the IMF. So for the United States, that was like a critical problem. For Israel, is a critical problem. For some Gulf states, it was a critical problem. So they were essentially like, how can we make it look good, like we're for democracy, but make it impossible for the actual people who would win in elections to come to power?
Wow. Okay. Eugene ruins everything. Okay. Eugene ruins the Save Darfur movement. Just by scratching the surface. It wasn't even a deep dive. It was just like it was like, okay, they were against the IMF and they were not down with the Abraham Accords, any of that. And the IMF, like, I mean, just double whammy. Like, I'm surprised they haven't just been completely nuked at this point.
Yeah. And it's not that some of the groups that were involved in Save Darfur did not have points. Many of them had points that were critical and important. It's just that the campaign, the way we were sold it, was not presenting it that way.
Well, I think it's hysterically funny that the thing that Zionists, or I hate saying Zionists, but the thing that apartheid enthusiasts are telling me to talk about relates right back to Israel. We're like, okay. I'm like, well, you told me to talk about this.
Right.
You hit my DMs and like, oh, you're anti-Semitic if you're not also talking about Sudan. We're talking about Sudan, and their problems also directly go back to Israel. And you told me to talk about this. Okay, God, okay. This should be funnier. Like, damn it. This is the cruel irony. Isn't it funny when you don't know history? That's amazing.
Yeah,
awesome.
Amazing. And that's what they don't want people to know.
They don't want people.
So that's the quick and dirty.
So that was the interview, and we will see you next week. Right?
Yeah, we'll see you next week.
Yeah, good. Cool. From all of us at We Are Not Journalists, I'm Maximilian Clark.
And I'm Walter Masterson.
And have your pets and animals sprayed and nuttered.
Yeah.
Nailed it.